we're trying to create these healthy places for healthier people. And that subject has really been important over the last couple of years, clearly. Not saying anything that nobody doesn't know and hasn't really experienced firsthand. And it's been over 100 years since we faced a pandemic of this magnitude, and it's really shined a bright light, not only on the need for healthier places and healthier landscapes, but also health disparities, how we meter out health and wellness in societies and in communities. The interesting observation is that during this 2-year period, greenways, these outdoor landscapes, these linear outdoor landscapes, have been some of the most popular places for people to go. They're the least restricted of outdoor landscapes. They're the most welcoming, and they're places where we've been able to go and continue to socialize with our neighbors. I know the Greenway in my neighborhood has never been more popular. It's a 2-mile circular trail, and it's been the place where we've been able to go as neighbors and see each other, as almost all other social functions that we used to have in our neighborhood have been canceled. And so greenways are more than just recreational corridors or places for exercise. They become sort of places of social framework for us. And they've become almost too popular in a sense in this period of time, because we've had 200, 300, 600% increase in year-over-year use in greenways. And so we've had to actually go in as greenway designers and greenway managers and remind people, to use them in a way that is socially responsible. So that's something that we've experienced. This whole notion of health and wellness is actually very tied to landscape. Landscape architecture began with this focus on health and wellness and the issue of well-being. And so parks, green spaces have their foundation in that historical framework. In the United States, it dates back in sort of earnest to Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux and the development of Central Park in New York City. This was something that was envisioned by a commission. At the time, New York was a very populated place, and overall health and wellness in the city was really failing. And so the commission created this notion for a Central Park, and Olmsted and Vaux won the commission, and they designed Central Park to be the lungs of the city, to really appeal at that time. And this is the mid 1800s. This is 1850s when this began. They really thought of this as a healthy landscape. And they also thought of it as a democratic landscape, because at that time, America was very class oriented, and there was no mixing of the classes. And so the general public did not have access to public space, to green space, to healthy landscapes. And this was one of the first landscapes that was created in America that changed that. If you were wealthy, you had perhaps your city residents, but you also had your country residents. And that's where a lot of people went to escape the health problems that were associated with cities. But for the common person, this was not the case. And so Central Park was a response to that. And so years later, we've continued to talk about the health and wellness benefits of outdoor spaces, of these landscapes. And we were talking for years about the benefits of trails before the pandemic. The pandemic sort of created this bright light on the ability of trails and outdoor spaces to address all kinds of health and wellness issues. And it's been magnified in that regard. I think the least talked about, even to this day, is the mental health and wellness issues that are associated with landscapes. These are places where we go to gain strength. We've had an increased conversation about forest bathing, about the importance of being outdoors to balance the stress and strain that's associated with the pandemic and what it's done to our social fabric, our lives. So outdoor landscapes have become really critical in terms of balancing mental wellness. But we would be remiss if we just thought that human health was the only important imperative of this time, of what we're going through. The ecologist Aldo Leopold said, you know, what's good for our body is good for our ecosystem. What he was trying to say was, we, humanity, is part of nature. And now this pandemic has shown us how fragile that relationship is. And when we think about the biosphere of our Earth, the landscape that sustains all life on this planet, when we're in it, and we're in it all the time, we live in it, we're actually kind of small in comparison to our biosphere. But when you get off the surface of this planet, and as astronauts did in the 1960s, starting in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and they began looking back at the Earth, and they realized, wow, the biosphere is actually really, really small in the context of both the planet and our solar system. And it's the only place that we know where this complex realm of life exists. And we really should be taking better care of it. We shouldn't be polluting it and trashing it, which unfortunately we tend to do as humans. In fact, you know, our construct, our sort of way of thinking about the biosphere is to understand what we can extract from it, how we can harvest it, how we can farm it, you know, for our benefit, and what we can take from it to create, you know, manufacturing. That's the way we've, you know, traditionally thought of the biosphere. But I really believe that as we continue this pattern of, you know, unabated, you know, building across the planet in all these different kind of ecosystems, we're creating a huge amounts of conflict for sustaining all kinds of life. And then on top of that, unfortunately, over the last, say, 75 years in particular, we have polluted the planet at an astronomical level. I just read an article just the other day, I think this was 2 days ago, where they're now beginning to detect microplastics in human blood. So this is the degree of pollution that we have created, that our species has created, and it's affecting all life on the planet. To, you know, even to the realm of industrial fishing, and just the magnitude of impact that we've had across the planet. So when we're talking about conservation of green space, we're not a bunch of just tree huggers. We are really talking about the ecological framework that sustains all life on the planet and our need to connect with it in a more meaningful manner. And so this is really what I wanted to write about with the Greenway Imperative, was how greenways respond to this essential framework of health. And this concept of One Health has really been circulating as a conversation around the globe. This understanding that we're connected, that everything we do is connected to the health of the planet, to the health of the ecosystems, conversely then to human health and to the health of all other creatures on the planet. And when we conduct our business, our daily business of extraction and harvesting and manufacturing and building and polluting, we're not just affecting the framework of animal life and plant life, we're ultimately affecting our own lives. So how do we get ourselves involved in reversing that kind of use or misuse? How do we get involved in conserving our plants' natural resources? I've been in the business of conservation now for over 35 years. I've devoted a career to it. And I will just tell you that the only places that I've seen success in having this conversation with just average people across this country, across North Carolina, and in different parts of the world is 3 areas: water, wildlife, and lifestyle. Those are the 3 opportunities that I've found that we can have meaningful conversation and meaningful buy-in to the world of conservation. And as I said, conservation isn't just a framework for you know, protecting nature. It's really a framework for living in a healthier community and a healthier planet. And so I just wanted to feature a couple projects. This one I'm still involved in down in South Carolina, Fort Mill, South Carolina. This is the Ann Springs Close Greenway. It's a 2,100 acre greenway. This is the namesake, Miss Close, who unfortunately passed away just within the last year. But she devoted her life to conservation. And she carved out a very, very large piece of land on family-owned property about 20 minutes south, 25 minutes south of downtown Charlotte. And it's turned into one of the most important privately managed preserves in North Carolina and South Carolina. It's the Ann Springs Close Greenway, and we set it up with her to manage this in perpetuity. In fact, when I started working with her in 1991, we established a 100-year vision for this landscape. We wanted to make sure that it outlived everyone that was involved, that it would be established in perpetuity. And we're really confident that that's what's going to happen. It's an amazing landscape. If you have a chance and want to go down and visit it, you can do it quite easily. There's lots of activities to do year round, but it's really a fabulous landscape. And it's a tribute to what we can do when we think about conservation and creating meaningful landscapes. This is one of the most meaningful landscapes in this part of North Carolina and South Carolina. And their membership over the last 2 years has just skyrocketed because it's one of the landscapes that people could go to and be a part of during this pandemic. We like to really say this is a landscape for the future. This is a landscape for the children. And we're doing even more on that landscape today to create opportunities for children to be exposed to nature, and to be raised as conservationists, to understand the value of conservation and living in healthy landscapes and healthy communities and on a healthy planet. So I'm so proud to have been involved in that project and to continue my involvement to this day. Another South Carolina project that I got called into help with was Charleston County. The county had passed a sales tax that raised over $225 million to protect green space, but they didn't really have a plan. They just had this one sentence in a bond referendum that was passed. And so they brought me in, and I one of the first things I said to them was, just as we wouldn't think about building a house without a blueprint, I mean, most of us wouldn't build a house without a blueprint. We shouldn't continue to grow our communities without a green print. We should have a conversation among all members of our community, all facets of our community, of what we love, what we treasure, what we value about the landscapes that we live in, the ecosystems that we live in, and what can we do to develop conservation plans, for those communities as we continue to grow. Charleston County, one of the fastest growing communities in the South, the fastest growing community in South Carolina. And when I sat down with this politically appointed group that represented all different kinds of interests in Charleston, I knew that they couldn't possibly agree on whether it was a weed or a flower, or whether it was different types of conservation measures that would be traditionally discussed. But I asked them, what is the lifestyle of Charleston County that you're most interested in preserving? And they said, we want to preserve the low country life. It's a life that all of us are familiar with. We grew up on the water. We grew up on these swamplands, and we want to preserve that for future generations of Charlestonians. And that's really the foundational element of the Greenbelt plan for Charleston County. It's looking at that land, at water, at lifestyle, at habitat, and preserving that for future generations. So they envision themselves as a city and villages surrounded by green. And they wanted to improve the amount of protected real estate. So we set a goal of protecting 1/3 of Charleston County that would not be subject to development. And they achieved that. And they achieved that. The plan was written for 25 years, but they achieved that actually in 11 years. And they protected more than 40,000 acres of land in Charleston County in 11 years. It's one of the best conservation programs of any county in the United States. And it's a testament to what we can do when we have that conversation with people about the landscapes they love and cherish and how they want to save those. In the introduction today, Suzanne talked about landscapes that I've worked on that were essentially a mitigation from an event that happened. In the spring of 1997, Grand Forks, North Dakota flooded. And I was brought in by the Army Corps of Engineers to help them resolve the flood. And the reason that I was brought in was the congressional delegation of North Dakota told the Army Corps that they didn't want the Corps to solve the flooding problem of Grand Forks in the way that they have done this traditionally in other parts of the United States. And furthermore, they wanted the Corps to use a greenway solution. And so the Corps contacted me and said, we don't know what the congressional people are talking about. We're not familiar with that concept at all. So we want you to come and work with us in creating this greenway strategy for Grand Forks, North Dakota. And not only did the town flood, but the downtown burned down, portions of it at the same time. And so they referred to this as come hell and high water. And I came into the community not all that familiar with it. My father grew up in North Dakota. He actually went to the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks. He was very familiar with the landscape. And I began to carve out a 2,000-acre landscape that could receive floodwaters in the future and not damage the surrounding community. And the reaction I got was quite visceral. First of all, people couldn't believe that I was suggesting to create such a large landscape in this part of North Dakota and Minnesota. One state park official stood up at a meeting and he said, this is more parkland in this one community than all of the rest of North Dakota combined. And the mayors of both towns stood up and said, you can't do this to us. You can't make us do this. We have no way of taking care of this amount of parkland. And so I began to talk about the resource being a destination landscape, a landscape that could take care of itself if it was programmed correctly, if we would hold events and festivals and all kinds of ways of welcoming people into this landscape. And I remember being at a city council meeting one night and doing this presentation. And one of the city council members very angrily asked me if I knew where I was that evening. And I said, yes, ma'am, I know where I am. I'm in Grand Forks, North Dakota. And she goes, no, you're not. You're in the middle of nowhere. You're on the way to nowhere and nobody's coming to your damn greenway. So that was a very interesting exchange that I had with the city council. So I didn't have a lot of local backing for the project, but I did fortunately have the backing of Congress, of the White House, of various different facets of the federal government, even if that was begrudgingly the case. And they succeeded in basically building this greenway. Well, one of the things I had talked about was having a Greenway Day. And they all thought I was pretty crazy. They said, well, nobody's going to come to your Greenway Day. But in 2003, they held the very first Greenway Day and 50,000 people attended. Now, the population of Grand Forks was 60,000. The population of East Grand Forks was 10,000. But a lot of people attended that day and have continued to come back to the Red River Greenway for many, many, many years. It's over 20 years in age, and it's become the most beloved, most popular landscape of Grand Forks. And it is the center of life. It's the center of culture and social framework. It is the landscape that knits together the social context of Grand Forks. And they're so proud of it today. They're so happy with the results of it. But it was difficult to envision it. And you can see this is the context. A 2,000-acre dedicated landscape that is essentially between two very, very small communities. But it's become very, very important landscape. And Rotary, by the way, this is the Rotary International Park. I worked with Rotary International during this, and we carved out a landscape for Rotary to do one of its demonstration parks. And I was so proud of my involvement back then with Rotary at the time. It's just a great example of how Rotary has a very impactful force in these communities. And Rotary was one of the really big supporters of this concept when it was launched. So it was great to have them as a partner. This is the monument that's dedicated to the 1997 flood. And believe it or not, that flood has reoccurred several times since this greenway was built, since the entire flood control project was built. It floods every year, and that's the whole point. This is a resilient landscape. It's designed to be impacted. And the Army Corps of Engineers has now come out and said, this is one of the best examples of a flood protection program that's a public amenity that we have anywhere in the country. So I feel just slightly vindicated that the vision has stood the test of time. I know a lot of your focus with your group is on social justice and the culture of communities. And that's been an area that I've worked in for a number of years. I wanted to share some examples of that. I'll go to one that's more, that happened recently. We were called in as part of a team by the Walton Family Foundation in Arkansas, and they wanted to create a greenway that would connect the 6 cities of Northwest Arkansas together. There was no path that was designated. We actually had to create the path out of literally nothing. And it was quite a challenging project. In fact, there were 122 separate property owners that had to be convinced to route the greenway through their property. This is one of those property owners. This was a family that I visited with. I sat on their back deck with them one night. We talked about the impact that this trail was going to have visually on their livelihoods and their property, and we moved it to this location. It turned out to be one of the more spectacular designed elements of the greenway. But this is a greenway that hooks all kinds of people together all across the community. We created new bikeable and walkable strategies within these 6 communities. This is a neighborhood. This is a minority neighborhood in Springdale, Arkansas, that we connected. Prior to this greenway being built, these parents would have to drive their kids to school. But as a result of creating the greenway, we now connect 3 public schools with these adjacent neighborhoods, and the parents take turns walking large groups of kids to and from the public schools. So we refer to these as walking school buses. And this is one of those unintended benefits that occurred as a result of the greenway. And in addition to being a corridor for bicycling and walking, it's also become a corridor of mitigation of the migrating monarch butterfly. Now is got a corridor where they can have habitat and food and resources for their journeys north and south. So it's become a very multi-dimensional landscape. But one of the things I'm so proud of with this work and other projects that we've been involved in is that I believe the strength of America is the fact that we celebrate all of this cultural diversity. We are the melting pot of the world. And if you think about the food we eat, the entertainment we enjoy, the music, there's just so many different facets of our lives that are richly influenced by all the different culture that has been a part of our country for over 300, almost 400 years. And like in the South, we love our barbecue. And a lot of people don't understand that the root of barbecue, the Southern barbecue, is really of African descent. And it's now, one of the really great staples of Southern food. And we don't make these connections often. And so what I think that greenways help us to do is to celebrate culture and diversity. And I did that when I went down to Miami, Florida. I was with the Cuban culture, the Latin American culture, and I'm there trying to work with the city of Miami and Dade County and the Trust for Public Land, creating a corridor of land that would be publicly accessible along the Miami River. Now, this was a landscape that was very troubled. There was a lot of illegal activities going on. There was people said, a good place to go die is the Miami River. And so I got a lot of pushback when I came into the community, and I had to sort of say, look, we're trying to paint a vision for a landscape that will be an amenity, not a liability. But I had a big problem, and that was trying to communicate this to a Latinx culture that did not quite understand Via Verde. Why is the way green, Chuck? That's what they would ask me. Why are we trying to create a green way along this corridor? And I was looking to Latinx culture and trying to properly frame the discussion. And I went to Cuba, and I discovered that in Cuba, in Havana, there's the Malecón. The Malecón is a cultural corridor. It's where people date. It's where families go. It's where fishermen go. It's where people go to play chess and checkers. But it's a cultural landscape. And I came back to Miami on subsequent trips and said, I would like to create the Malecón in downtown Miami. And everybody got really excited. It was a cultural connection. It wasn't about a green way in a sense of an environmental culture corridor. It was a place for families to gather. And that's the strength of the Miami River Greenway today. And it's led to the creation then of the Underline, which is an extension of that greenway and a very, very popular corridor now in downtown Miami. So it's these kind of cultural connections that I think are so valuable, part of the social framework of America. And I've had a chance now over the last 7 years to work in Memphis, Tennessee on a greenway, which I think is really, really significant for American history. When I went to Memphis in 2014 and I started making a presentation about doing a greenway with the Wolf River Conservancy, I had a woman who approached me that said, Mr. Flink, do you think that the Greenway will heal the racial divide in Memphis? Because we haven't been the same since Dr. King was assassinated in 1968. The assassination unraveled the community of Memphis. And it created, unfortunately, a situation where no investment occurred in the North Memphis neighborhoods, which are largely African-American, for over 50 years. In fact, we were one of the first groups that came into those North Memphis neighborhoods and wanted to do new investment. There was actually disinvestment that occurred for a 50-year stretch. So we came in with this greenway, and it was a difficult conversation to have to begin with, because a lot of people were like, why do we want to do a greenway? What does a greenway have anything to do with the lives of African Americans who live in North Memphis? What is the benefit going to be in talking about a greenway in that regard? And we began to unpack the various different multiple benefits that we felt would be bestowed upon these neighborhoods. And there was a reluctance at the very beginning of our conversations. There was a reluctance on buy-in. But over time, and we've been at this now for a number of years, people have really come to understand the benefits of conservation, the benefits of connecting people with the land around them and these resources. And the landscape from which these pictures is taken is a 100-acre landscape that borders a number of residential areas. And it has a 25-acre lake on it. And we're able now to introduce people to nature. We're able to create a more cohesive social infrastructure for people. There are now more than 100 programs that are going on a year in these landscapes, which never existed prior to us being there. And we feel like we're making a very valuable contribution to the social framework of this community, of these neighborhoods, with the different types of events and programs that we're offering. And I think it's having tangible benefits to generations that are old and young alike, and creating important connections in that regard. So my book, The Greenway Imperative, is essentially a call to action. It's looking at different landscapes around the country. And oh, by the way, happy to get into this discussion as well in the Q&A portion, but I also did a chapter on Belarus, which is yet another story, which I probably don't have time for. But the book overall is a call to action. It's an attempt to link people to the values and the benefits of conservation, to create a resilient framework for nature and civilization, to suggest that there's ways in which we can live in better harmony with each other and with the environment. This is the only home that we have in the universe. We have been looking for life, constantly for 50, 60 years, very actively. And thus far, even within our own solar system, even having advanced equipment now on the planet of Mars, we have yet to find any form of life that exists anywhere outside of our planet. That's not to suggest that it doesn't exist. We know that it exists. We know that there are conditions that are right for life to exist all throughout our universe. But right now, this is the home that supports our level of complex life. And as much as I love the fact that people want to get off this planet and explore other places, I wish there was more concentrated effort right now on this planet of understanding how valuable the biosphere is, the ecosystems that we live in are, and how important they are to sustaining all life on our planet. And I feel like greenways, to build a greenway is to build a community, which is the famous quote of my friend Charles Little. And it's to leave a legacy for future generations, that this is something that they can get involved in. It's very tangible, it's very local, it's something that can benefit each and every one of us. And my book is available in many, many different locations. If you're interested in buying it, probably the easiest is just through Amazon.com, but Walmart sells it, Barnes & Noble sells it, and of course my publisher, the University Press, sells it as well. Again, Suzanne, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to come in and make this presentation today. I'm going to go ahead and stop my share and see if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask or any comments that they'd like to make in regards to the presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yes, we do have a question. And Charlie, do you want to go ahead and just unmute yourself and ask the question?
Sure. I was definitely, excuse me, interested in what we're doing in North Memphis. I was the public health director for Memphis and Shelby County during the 1980s. So
You're very familiar with it.
Oh yeah, I'm familiar with the politics, the racial divide, and all the things that every time I go back, it still sounds the same. More specifically on North Memphis is what got my attention. We had some serious issues of pollution in the Fraser area, and also the infamous Hollywood dump.
That's right.
So the rivers were noted, the Wolf, the Nankana, and several of the others were noted for pollution. They were not safe for fishing or drinking or anything.
Right.
Has that improved over time?
I would say what we've been doing is we're actually building a portion of our greenway over the top of the North Hollywood landfill. We're in the Fraser neighborhoods. We're actually trying to, do what we can to do mitigation. But as you know, Charlie, the problems really go beyond a single project. But what we're trying to do is plant a flag. And I think for 50, 60 years, as you well know, people had abandoned the landscapes and the neighborhoods and the people that lived in this part of Memphis.
Yes.
They walked away and there was no investment, and we're the first investment. And what we're trying to say is these problems are beyond a single project. They're huge. We're not going to solve them, with our Greenway efforts. But what we're going to do is we're going to create this green corridor that it doesn't make it out of sight, out of mind anymore. It actually puts you in direct contact with it. So now you can't, I was in Cincinnati prior to this, and I remember working on another polluted landscape, the Mill Creek. And the committee that I was working with said, Chuck, do we have to go to clean up the place first? Or is it okay that we put people in contact with the polluted place? And I said, well, honestly, if you don't put people in contact with the polluted place, they're never going to know that it's a landscape that needs to be cleaned up. And so that's been our strategy, Charlie. It's like you said, the problems are overwhelming. I think we've made some progress. We've cleaned up some areas that were open landfills, open dumping. We've created a sense of pride, a sense of ownership in these landscapes. We've created a pathway where people can get access to them. And what we're hopeful of is that'll be catalytic. Then that'll cause people to say, wait a minute, can't we clean up this little area? And can't we clean up this area? And maybe over time, and it may take a long time, maybe another 50 years, but maybe over time, it'll be catalytic in that regard. I've seen it happen in other landscapes. I've seen what's happened in Cincinnati. I've seen what's happened in Miami. I've seen that catalytic effect happen in a fairly short amount of time, 10, 15, 20 years. And so we're hopeful that that's what we're going to do. It's been interesting to see in the 8 years that I've been in Memphis, how things have changed in the groups that we've worked with from probably your starting point. And to some degree, that still exists. But I'm really proud of the work of the Conservancy. The Conservancy has really changed attitudes and changed minds. And it's still a very, very large problem, though. And we still wouldn't recommend anybody eating the fish. And we still have lots of problems with pollution in those neighborhoods. But I feel like, we've started the process a different direction. So thank you for that question. And thank you for your familiarity with that community, because it always helps to talk through
on and on with it. But I think this is a terrific project. And I think as you characterize the people in North Memphis, white and black, had been felt that they, and rightly so, been neglected for a very long period of time. And I think in retrospect, that's what accounted for a lot of what made, frankly, my life and others quite difficult for a while. This is a terrific project, and thank you.
Yeah, I just feel honored and blessed to be able to work with them and to work through that racial divide and try to be a part of healing it, and then giving everybody collectively, let's all band together and work on something that we think will have a beneficial outcome in our community. So it's always that way. So thank you, Charlie. Yep.
Any other questions?
Yep, there's a
Chris?
raised hand. Yep.
Yep.
Yeah.
Chris?
Sorry. Was born in Johnstown, Pennsylvania.
Oh.
And yeah, it was the flood city.
Yeah, path of the flood. Yep. Mhm.
Yeah. And when the Corps of Engineers came in there, of course, it was years ago, all they did was put cement.
Yep.
And in the middle of the city, through the poorer sections.
Yeah.
And it's all just cement. And if they would have had this vision as you have, that town might have done. Now it's just in the Rust Belt, and they could have done so much more to it if they would have thought. And it flooded again a couple times. Yeah.
You're right, Chris. And actually, I serve on the board of directors of the 9/11 National Memorial Trail, which is attempting to connect the 3 memorials in New York City, Pentagon, and Shanksville, PA. So Johnstown is actually one of the communities that's in our sites, and we're trying to, it's hard when you do that level of investment, and it's been there for 50, 60 years, whatever it's been. I mean, it's a long time. It's hard to sort of go into the community and say, well, we're going to undo all that, because that's not realistic. But we're trying to, again, just like in Memphis, we're trying to chip away and create a better connection between the people of Johnstown and their surrounding neighborhoods, and a connection to this trail, which a lot of people look at today as a landscape of healing. So there are many members who lost family members during 9/11 that will bike the trail or walk it, or use it in some way, and it's a way for them to have some closure and some healing. And then we get to Johnstown, which has a different dramatic event that happened that represents the same opportunity. And I think that's what's special about these greenways and these linear landscapes, is that they do provide an opportunity for remembrance and reflection. One of the things that's happening in Grand Forks is there was a residential neighborhood that was really, really popular that people just didn't want to let go of. We actually left all the street fabric in place. We only removed the houses. The gardens, the sidewalks, even some of the driveways are still there. And they actually hold memorial events in that neighborhood for the past 20 years. And they have that connection, that cultural connection, that social connection to life in those neighborhoods. And, that's an important part of the work that we do. And the Johnstown community is a special community to me. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
It's a good place to be from right now.
Yeah, that's right.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead,
Jackson.
Jackson.
So I just find it fascinating that the Greenways almost pay for themselves. Like with the Grand Forks example, you're talking about how, it was a huge upkeep to take care of all this green space. But in your book, you talk about one of the largest outdoor retailers was actually interested in this area because all this green space. I just find it fascinating.
Jackson, that's been the revelation over the last few years, and that I continue to have that conversation all the time. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the things, those of us who are older on this call, I mean, I think there's a mindset that this is an expense, right? First of all, it's an expense. Second of all, it's an expense the community can't afford. And we've been trying to flip that around and say, no, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for economic health and wellness and vitality. And that's what you're pointing out, Jackson. And that's something that we continue to pick up. In fact, I had a conversation last night with a gentleman about economic mobility and economic viability. And interested in, where do we have evidence of this, in sort of a mobile nature, not just a static nature of a landscape or community. So it is the conversation, I think, Jackson, that is, most relevant. I would say there's 2 things: diversity, equity, inclusion, and being recognizing the disparities in American culture and trying to be more intentional, as your motto talks about, being intentional about closing gaps in American society and American culture. And then secondly, about economic opportunity. How do we use these landscapes to create more economic opportunity for people? And I think a lot of the projects that I've been fortunate to work on have focused on that. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the hottest topics that is going around the country is where we can do this to spur economic vitality. And that's why I wanted to include it in the book. And I included it in two stories. One was the Grand Forks, and the other was the discussion of being in Belarus and being in an agricultural community, and how they were looking, to diversify their economy. And I think that has great application here in rural America. So thank you for bringing that up, Jackson.
Yeah, of course. I really enjoyed reading your book. It was really well written.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Would you tell us about that really long trail?
The East Coast Greenway, it's 3,000 miles. It's one of the longest urban greenways. I think to me, it's the longest urban greenway in America. And it was designed specifically to connect towns and cities. So I like to say it's the urban equivalent of the Appalachian Trail, which is also very long distance. But the Greenway, East Coast Greenway, really goes through the heart of Washington, D.C., New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, and then the cities in the South. It goes through Durham and Raleigh. We're actually trying to make a urban connection in downtown Raleigh, something called the Strollway. We're going to go through, going through Miami and Charleston and Savannah. So it's really great in that regard. And it's taking on a life of its own. It's becoming very popular. In fact, I was at their board dinner last night in downtown Durham, and they were saying that they are now recording in excess of 50 million visits a year on the built sections of the East Coast Greenway, making it the most visited green space in America. It's more visited than any national park as a single unit. And so it's really it's exciting. And with only a little more than a third built, they are very excited about what the future holds for the East Coast Greenway. They could easily record annual visits of over 100 million a year with completion. And it becomes a very significant cultural landscape for international visitation. People all over the world want to come, get on a bike, and ride across America's landscapes and America's cities, and just experience them on a bike. And that's a pretty interesting strategy and marketing sort of program. I actually led a group of cyclists from Wilmington, Delaware to New York City, a 260-mile ride that we did over 7 days many years ago. And it was, I asked all the riders who had done international riding, I said, where does this rank among the international rides that you've done? And they said it's at the top, because we've never seen American communities like this from a bike, and we've never witnessed the cultural framework of America as we have the last 7 days. So I'm really excited about the future of the East Coast Greenway. I played a very small role in it, helping to get it started and seeing it through as chairman of the board. But it's a great American landscape, and I wanted to tell that story in the book because I think it's an important one to share.
I'm really glad to hear about it because I was not as aware. So now I'm going to have to do some digging.
Yeah, and the nice thing is I would, if you're in the area, if you're in the Triangle area, try to experience it locally. If you can literally ride from downtown Durham to downtown Raleigh. 90% of it is off-road. And if you're like me, if you're in your 60s, you may want to get an electric bike, just saying, it might help. But it's a great ride. You ride through all kinds of different landscapes, basically connects Durham, Cary, and Raleigh. You go by the North Carolina Museum of Art. You go through different types of campus settings. You go through Umstead Park. It's a great ride, and it'll take you all day. And you may want to think about maybe lining up an Uber or something to take you back to where you started. I've had several people who've done that, but it's a great way of experiencing the East Coast Greenway here in your local area. And then if you want to take on other rides, you can just contact the East Coast Greenway and say, where else can I do rides like this? Because there's a ride from Baltimore, Maryland to Washington, D.C. There's a ride to New York City. There's all kinds of really great rides. And oh, by the way, they sponsor rides. So if you want to go on one of their sponsored rides, you can get up with them and take a ride with them. The ride that I led, by the way, I had two 80-year-old women who were on the ride. So I just want to let you know that there's no age constriction on participating with the East Coast Greenway. If you have a bike and you want to get with some friends and go ride, that's the great thing about the East Coast Greenway.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation. We've enjoyed it, and I'm inspired to see what I can do about getting your book on my Kindle and enjoying that. So Suzanne, thank you again for bringing Dr. Flink here. Carol, I'm going to turn it over to you to please share your screen.
Yes, indeed. And we'll move on.
Yes, please. And so, Dr. Flink, we have a certificate of appreciation for you speaking to our club today. I will go ahead and email that to you.
Thank you so much. That's awfully nice.
Well, we appreciate your time, and it was a very engaging, and I can see why the Environmental E-Club decided you were their best program of the year. So thank you so much for speaking to us. Next slide, please.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
I will let you talk with our upcoming events.
Right. So, announcements, upcoming events. This was Melissa Mills sent us this. This is on Saturday. So, we're looking at tomorrow, but it's a pop-up event sponsored by Cocoa Drip, who they focus on supporting Black women-owned businesses. So it's from 12 to 3 tomorrow. The address is not on the flyer there, but it is, Melissa did provide it. It's at Forest Hills Park here in Durham, 1639 University Drive. And Melissa found out about it or wanted to point out that a friend, a girl that a woman she's known since the woman was 10 years old, Natalia Mills, will be there. Her new business, A Little Piece of Heaven, which is a family boutique, will be there, but all sorts of Black women-owned businesses will be represented at this event. So a good thing to do if you're there in Durham tomorrow afternoon. Other reminders, of course, next week is the tour, the Civil Rights and Social Justice Tour down to Alabama to look at Alabama, Montgomery, and Selma. And then, of course, don't forget District Conference coming up in May. You can register. It's in Winston-Salem. You can register at DACDB. And in line with that, let me point out our upcoming meetings. Next meeting in the 8th, we'll have Jen Foster and Jocelyn Ramirez Mendoza speaking on the NC State C3 collaboration, which is a dual admission program between NC State and some community college partners. So that should be really interesting. And then on the end of April, we have Yvette Holmes from the Southeast Raleigh Promise. So that should be really interesting as well. Then our first meeting normally in May would be on the 13th, but since that is also the date of DISCOM, we will not be having a meeting. So again, I encourage you to look at attending that. It should be a lot of fun downtown Winston-Salem at the Millennium Center. Information and registration is available on DACDB. So anybody else have any announcements or other business they want to bring up? So if not, then we will close with the 4-way test. So who would like to read that today? Chris, you want to read the 4-way test for us?
The 4-way test are the things we think, say, and do. First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? 3, will it build goodwill and better friendships? And 4, will be beneficial to all concerned.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you again, Dr. Flink, for your great presentation. Everyone be safe. Have a great weekend. Enjoy, and we will see you in 2 weeks. So
Yes.
bye, y'all.
Well,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Jackson, for coming.
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Bye, Jackson.
Bye.